All right. Welcome, everyone. 10:30 p.m. Thank you for staying.
Oh.
Mandy. Welcome, everyone. Strange times, certainly. And as I said in the invitation that a number of you received personally, I think most of us are probably experiencing some level of death by webinar. And so with that as an understanding, I humbly, Anne and I, who I'll introduce here in a moment, humbly thank you. We feel privileged to have your time and attention today. There are important conversations that are happening, very, very fundamentally, existentially important conversations. I'm hoping that today's conversation will be relevant and actionable for some of you, hopefully inspiring for some. But again, we understand your time is precious and you're spending a lot of time on Zoom and webinars. So with that, I'm going to share my screen for a moment here and formally kick this off. Incidentally, if any of you do need to leave early, or if you have colleagues with whom you ultimately feel this content is relevant, we are recording it. We will distribute it. Feel free to send us a note if you don't see it in the social groups. Casey, is the title slide coming through?
Yep, you're set.
Okay, welcome, big blue planet of ours. We've got, I think, every continent represented here in the moment. This is the first of a three-part series that we've humbly titled Reimagining Workplace. This is part one, Augmenting Work from Home with On-Demand Office. And it is my distinct pleasure to have here beside me today the cheese, if you will, in today's sandwich, Anne Bamesberger, my friend and colleague. Quickly, I'm Mark Gilbreath. I'm the founder and skipper at LiquidSpace, and Anne Bamesberger is the Senior Director of Workplace Effectiveness at Genentech. Broad sweep of our conversation today. I'm going to lead off by letting Anne share with us a bit of her journey of the past 2+ decades in the world of workplace. She's had an uncanny ability to repeatedly position herself in communities and amongst companies that are sincerely on the cutting edge of workplace thinking. And I'll let her elaborate on that for us. After Anne lays out a bit of her long arc and some of her accumulated first principles, we'll kind of zoom out and take stock of where we all stand today. These are grave days, but we'll take a look and sort of frame the current canvas or landscape of workplace and set the stage for a further discussion then about one of the areas that we are hearing a chorus of sort of need around, which is how do we start to think about reentry, and in particular, how do we contemplate augmenting the workplace that is home for so many right now, which is their homes. And then we'll wrap up at the end with a little more free-form conversation around what might lie beyond that. So with that, let me flick it back to you, Anne, and I'd love for you to just share with us a bit of that distinctive arc of yours over the last 4 months.
It makes me feel kind of old, but that's okay. I think there's another word for that. It's called wise. I probably know many of you who have dialed in, and I'm grateful for this opportunity, and also hope to learn from you as well. The history of Anne really happened probably at Sun Microsystems, and I saw Jay sort of explaining, what was Sun and why Sun. I did come out to the West Coast to go to college, so I'm from the East Coast originally. Have European background, so relatively global childhood, but fundamentally settled in California, surprisingly settled by having worked in high tech. Early on when I graduated and started working, HP was one of my first companies, and then that's where you learn how to manage by walking around, the great management principles of Hewlett Packard. And then I landed at Sun, which ended up being a sea change for me in terms of what you call my worldview. And I will attribute the worldview to having worked for what at the time was a very progressive Unix-based company that was considering the internet as a phenomenon that was inevitably going to happen. So, we were the dot in .com. We were thin client distributed computing. We were going to bridge the digital divide. I drank the Kool-Aid, and I think that really shaped my mental model. I'm a civil engineer, so you think I'd want to be building buildings. But I did migrate while I was at Sun. I was always in corporate real estate. That's been my thing for my entire career. But at Sun, we really created a mental mindset around the internet, really providing distributed information, distributed computing, and the ability to pretty much work anywhere, anytime on any device. And those were the A's that we were all drinking years ago. So I think, Mark, I have to give Sun a lot of credit for having created a platform for my worldview, which is, I do believe that people fundamentally want to do good work. I think that they want to be valued for their contributions. And I think that that can happen in a distributed fashion if the job warrants it. And I know we'll get a chance to talk about Genentech, because having gone from a highly distributed mindset into one that was more conservative, appropriately so, because we do research and we do manufacturing on a very important site, the birthplace of biotech, which, oh, by the way, was in South San Francisco 40 plus years ago. And the history is right there in that little campus that I'm now responsible for. So hopefully we'll get a chance to chat about the different cultures and how very important they are to this topic.
You know, it sort of just occurred to me, and everyone sort of talks about one of the sort of grounding aspects of what we're all going through today is the fact that it's the biggest sort of shared world experience perhaps in history. If I sort of ask the question, like, what was the last sort of global experience of anywhere near that scale, you might make the argument that it was, Sun, and the network is the computer and the onset of the internet, right? I mean, that as a pervasive sort of phenomenon or replumbing, and you guys were built around that or facilitated it in many ways.
Absolutely, and I think it did create an orientation. We did create a program there that was called Open Work. Not because of open offices, please, I do not want to discuss open versus closed. The open work was meant to be transparent, was meant to be available for others to be shared. It was sort of the beginnings of what now seems to be almost old news. So it's strange for me because now everybody's an expert, because everyone's now been liberated to actually see that working from home is a legitimate place of work.
And how consistent is the reality that people are sitting in right now in terms of how they're working, how they've hacked out workplace in the last 2 months? How consistent is that with kind of the aspirational vision that was held by you and Tenant and others at Sun 25 years ago?
It's crazy. I'd say the one thing that I'm experiencing is the fact that it's a mandate. And the mandate is not cool. We always felt that liberating the workforce was our main mission, to have them do their best work, and that always involved choice. This being a mandate is a little different. I'm finding myself a little more anxious than I normally would be, and I'm so used to working from home. I've always worked from home ever since I could, from years ago. This was over 20 years ago at Sun. But now that everybody is, I'm a little COVID weary. So it's going to be interesting to see what my behavior is going to be upon return. And I know we'll talk about that today as well.
Yeah, well, let's hold on to a couple of those principles you just touched on, such as choice versus mandate, and that notion of, or that philosophy of how people do their best work. And let me share my screen again. Let's step forward into kind of a landscaping of the world we live in here today as a stage setting, and for you to talk a bit more about Genentech's recent history.
Okay.
So let me get to the next slide here. So how quaint it is actually to remember January. It seems like a long time ago. So, but let me just sort of start by commenting on, workplace as we knew it, or the way we described it in the CRE world. The narrative was core, and for some companies that were progressive, it was core plus flex. And even despite the headlines of the last 5 years and the extraordinary growth of co-working and serviced office and flexible office, 50% of net absorption last year in North America, still it was relatively modest, single-digit percentages of the overall workplace footprint, either in square footage terms or people served. Furthermore, as recently as January, work from home for most companies was an informal, unregulated, unmanaged, in some cases unapproved activity.
Mhm.
It was out of sight and out of mind. How quaint that seems, and how the world has changed. I somewhat flippantly, I might predict that history will look back on this episode as a great workplace migration. But to be literal, for many companies, 95%, and comments on Genentech, but for many companies, 90+% of the workforce is at home today, right now. Just give us a data point on that, Anne. How?
Well, no, I find that absolutely fascinating. And I was talking to a former employee of mine, Chirag Kadiwar, who's now at Facebook. And I think most of you probably, at least in the Bay Area, know that Facebook has announced that it's going to work from home through the end of the calendar year. And that's pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
And I have to smile when I say, you know, a place-based work environment like Genentech, which historically was pretty much only face-to-face, 90% is now working from home. Now, it has downsides. I think unlike a high-tech community where you can keep programming and you can keep working the way you might have been working before, we clearly in our manufacturing and labs are experiencing people who do need to work and people who do need to go into the office. And we've continued to make our medicines. Manufacturing is obligated to get our products out. But it is remarkable how many of those people at Genentech who fundamentally believed that they had to go to the office are now experiencing an, oh my goodness. And for me, it's just like mind-boggling. It's like, wow, you know, it's kind of weird because I kind of knew that, but I couldn't, right? Again, it's about choice. I would never make anybody do something that they're uncomfortable doing.
Well, for people like you and I and others on the call, Jay Brand, Steve Hargis, others that are listening in today who have lobbied for 10+ years the virtues of offering choice and empowerment, for the pendulum to swing this far further than we ever imagined is jarring, and this happened relatively overnight. But now, of course, you know, the chaos of that has started to settle. The clarity that the world is different is now, I think, a widely held sort of understanding, and the real work of contemplating reentry is afoot. You know, markets are beginning to open. While some companies are saying you don't have to come back until January, markets are opening, right? And so, you know, reentry now becomes the topic, and you see a lot of entities sort of rallying to argue for the return to something like normal, right? And to lay out the playbooks on how we make what was the new normal. And I firmly believe that that's the wrong mindset, or at least an impractical mindset. So where are we right now? There are new challenges on the plate of most of the workplace leaders on this call. And there are two new challenges that weren't even contemplated in January or in years past. Number one, you are all wrangling with this incredibly challenging topic of de-densification. I'm now hearing most companies, you know, anticipating 50 to upwards of 80% de-densification in their campuses, and racing toward their reentry plans and their 6-foot playbooks, and how will we make the campus a safe and acceptable and appealing place. So that's challenge one, lots of work happening there. That's defend the establishment, defend the prior status quo. From the other end of the spectrum, and I'll call it the Anne Bamesberger first principles end of the spectrum, everybody's at home right now, right? And we're beginning to see the outlines of sort of 3 interesting cohort groups amongst that community. Of the people working at home right now, it's becoming evident that a number of them are finding that they're happy about it, as you've been for you know, quite some time. And in many cases as well, those individuals are evidencing their ability to work effectively to their management as well. And the prediction around this particular cohort group is they're likely going to want to emigrate to work from home. Mm-hmm. In fact, a recent Gartner report of a surveying of 300 CFOs from S&P 500 companies said that you know, that those interested, happy emigrees have a very intriguing ally now in the CFO of a lot of companies, mm-hmm. who are now planning on that emigration base being nominally 5% or is up to 20+% on a permanent basis, right? So interesting allies amidst the crisis. There's a second cohort group that we're seeing and hearing from who are mostly happy. Like home has been a relief, not commuting's been a relief. Avoidance of the distractions that can be a part of some corporate headquarters, it has been a relief. But they periodically or episodically are needing something more than that, whether it's a day or a point in time when the home is distracting, or whether there is work that they seek to do with others that's pulling them from home. They're mostly happy but want something more. And then the third cohort group are some portion, could be substantial, that are distinctly unhappy and they can't wait to get back to breakfast, lunch, and dinner served at the campus, or time with their colleagues, or an environment that has the tools and the mechanisms that they need. So as we think about reentry, I'll argue that these are the two critical solution areas, and we're going to spend the rest of today's conversation really zeroing in on that, those mostly happy and unhappy individuals that are at home today. And what steps can we take? What steps can a thoughtful leader of workplace take to augment home? And to sort of tee up your telling of Genentech's story, I'll dumb it down a little bit.
Okay.
If the spectrum of workplace has suddenly become home plus the possibility of flex,
Right.
plus the HQ that's sitting empty right now, but awaiting the return of some number of employees. But looking at the question of what does workplace need to be from the lens of the employee at home, Anne, as you and I have talked in the past, there are arguably two modalities that will pull people from home. One will be those tasks or situations where they need to do individual work, but home doesn't work. And secondly, will be those tasks or modalities where they and other of their colleagues, teammates, need to come together for work that is distinctly team-oriented, or because one or all of them, want to marinate in the companionship and in the culture of one another, for the social aspects. And so, with that as a backdrop, Anne, let's roll back the clock a little bit and take us through sort of the origin story, the prior state that led Genentech on a path to today, where you've got a vibrant and well-appreciated on-demand office capability. I think it's about, 4 years back?
Yeah, plus or minus. I think some of the people on the phone may recall my having gone to Genentech. There was a purpose. It was essentially the head of site services at the time kind of knew that we needed another office building. We were growing at the time, and wanted to know if I could get more people in cubes, because we couldn't fit enough people into an office building. So we'd have to move from owned offices, private offices, to cubes. Everyone had an office at Genentech. Everyone in theory was going in every day at Genentech. And when I started six plus years ago, one of the first things I noticed was half of them were empty, which I'm sure we've known that for years, that half of the offices are always empty. And surprisingly, it's been that number for years. And it's because mobility was already a big part of life. And having been at Sun, I kind of came in with that mindset and kind of looked around saying, well, people are not in the office every day. Oh, yes, they are. Well, no, they're not. So we basically embarked on a research-based, again, science company, very, 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 very data-driven, very, very, very smart people, to start looking at, the reality of potentially sharing, because their work was shifting from individual to team, which is relevant to this conversation indeed. But it was also clear that technology was letting people be more flexible. Now, we did not have a work from home program at Genentech. It was not allowed. And I'm like, what? It's like, I'm gonna right away be the rogue here. Plus South San Francisco is probably the longest I've ever had to commute from Palo Alto. So, and the commute's gotten really bad over the last few years. So we embarked on a collective program. Again, many tenets that I think are important and will be near and dear to the folks on the phone, making sure this wouldn't be a mandate. We never want to make anybody do something that they don't want to do. So preference is very, very important. The ability of the work. I mean,
And let me pause you on that just for a moment. I mean, right now, the health and safety mandate is you have to work from home. But 4 years ago, when you brought this strongly held view that it can't be a mandate, broadly speaking, what antibodies did you run into in leadership or culture?
Well, it's really interesting that you asked that, because we did have a shift in CEOs. I've had 3 CEOs in the 6 years that I've been there, and you can see the mindset has been shifting over these 3 years very, very quickly, actually. And I think, to be fair, I think the company has a very, very strong culture about relationship and face-to-face, and they don't want to wreck that. They never want to wreck that, nor do I want them to. But the idea was, on the margin, we're spending a lot of money on bricks and mortar that could go back into the pipeline. So there was a slight cost element, although it wasn't the main driver. The main driver was retention, perceived productivity for individuals who were actually commuting, some more than an hour. I mean, mine was about 30 minutes at the beginning. It became an hour over time, but people don't want to commute more than 45 minutes one way. And it's not productive to spend that much time in a car. It's hard to work in a car unless you're a salesperson on the phone. And so there were so many value props around the individual value proposition for the employee, around making their lives more productive by giving them time back to themselves. And that had a heck of a lot to do with the demographics and with how long the commutes were becoming over time. So the ability to actually, and it took a while. I mean, there were huge antibodies and big surprise. At the time, it was actually senior management too. The senior management evolved, middle management remained resistant. And now, because of what's been going on, it's going to be very, very hard for those middle managers to say, no, you have to be in the office because the work is getting done. And there's proof of that because we now are valuing managing by contribution, which might not have been true before. It might have been more of the social line of sight and everybody's here, so they must be working. But now the contributions are actually even more apparent because this being networked and being online forces explicit showing and explicit presence management for individuals so they don't feel out of sight, out of mind. So the network has come in really handy. And even before the COVID, the idea was, let's start managing by results. Millennials want that, they expect that, they deserve that. And the idea was, let's create a work from home program, but some people might not be able to work from home and maybe they needn't commute that far. So the advent of our drop-in program was an attempt to provide a benefit, if you will, for the employee, a place to work that wouldn't be home. And it might be close demographically to where they live. So it's no big surprise. Our drop-in centers are geographically proximate to where concentrations of people live. We have a high concentration in the East Bay. We have a high concentration in the South Bay. And we have lots of people who live in San Francisco and South City, but they would either commute in or work from home. So we don't have a drop-in center there yet. But what was interesting is when we started, it was kind of a loss. It was kind of like making people nervous that, we're not trying to keep people from coming into the office. That was not it. Everything has to be, it's part of the program. It's part of the network. It's part of Genentech. And so we were very careful to brand them as Genentech locations. And they weren't deemed to be satellites. They were deemed to be an affordance for individuals who could then use the drop-in center on their way to either go to work and use it as a place on the way. But to be honest with you, it was probably a destination for the day. And in our experience, at least pre-COVID, pretty much everybody out of 12,000 employees wanted to be able to work this way, either home or at a drop-in center 1 to 2 days a week. It's nothing like what we're seeing now. And I think that's going to be interesting to discuss. Has that shifted dramatically? We had about 100 people sign up initially. We did not advertise. It was a kind of a loss leader and word of mouth went out. And
Ann, I think that I've seen that principle sort of run through your long arc of make it an option, not a mandate, and that will reveal the truth, right?
Well,
Like,
and you know what's so nice is this business with especially short term. I mean, what's the risk? You know, it's not like we're building buildings.
Right.
You know, and the last thing we want to do is build buildings. I mean, the beauty of being able to rent space on demand is that you can try it. You know, it's a try it. You might like it, and if you don't, we'll stop renting it. So it was a perfect storm because word of mouth became viral. People told other people. We got all kinds of testimonials about how this kept me from quitting because, you know, my husband was sick and I had to be able to, you know, but I couldn't work from home and I was able to, you know, handle the kids. And the testimonials just came roaring in, which really got to the attention of our senior management. It was not the whole population. It was like 100 people initially. It grew to about 1,000, which is still, you know, 12,000 people, 1,000 is not a lot, but we eventually opened it to everybody. And unfortunately, this was recently, and now we've got the added information that's coming with the work from home, making this probably even more likely for more participation in the future.
Yeah, and for those on the call that are not familiar with sort of flexible office as a category, when we use that term, when Ann and I use that term, we're referring to sort of workspace as a service operators, right. Co-working spaces, serviced office chains, even landlords now that are providing transactionalized on-demand space. And you know, Genentech that had the sort of foresight, and we'll credit, to sort of driving them in the direction of wanting to tap into flexible office. They had the enviable position of being based in the Bay Area, which has hundreds of these points on the map from which they could give it a try. You know, where had COVID not happened, what was the next logical extension of your network of?
Well, I'm glad you said that, because really in the midst of all this happening, and I think we saw it sooner than others that this was going to happen. The company had actually embarked on, and this came out of Roche, so this came out of the mothership in Switzerland. They were really wanting the company to experience agility, you know, kind of like in the Sundays, you know, the Scrum, the 24/7 global, and the global software at engineering, where people, in our day it was scrums, now they're calling them squads. And the whole idea was to kind of begin to think about getting to market faster. So agility is a big buzzword now. I'm a little over all the buzzwords, but it's a big one. And flexibility fits in with that mindset. Resilience fits in with that mindset. All these words that people are now embracing. So the advent of agility meant that a lot of our business units, reminding everyone that I've got research, which is lab-based, I've got manufacturing, which is process-based, but I also have product development, which are people doing clinical trials. I also have sales and marketing, which is definitely an office-based function. So a lot of these people are going through learning how to be on teams. And the advent of teams, which we've always wanted to tackle, is providing a terrific opportunity to think through how do teams work best. And in our case, a lot of them were face-to-face. So we had the proximity, we did have the office, they could preserve state on the walls because we already built the work environment where they could do that. Mm-hmm. And the next thing for me was to figure out geographically where, again, this is very geographically based too, because teams that are global are not going to fly in to go to one of these flexible offices. Mm-hmm. But clearly where there are people who live geographically proximate to each other, which in our field is very true, are at a point where when they do need to convene, when they do want to get together, and it's not all the time, what kind of affordances can we construct for them? And this was and it still is on my plate, to look for geographic locations that are workable based on the demographics of teams, and that they can then customize as they need to do the work that they need to do, which is necessarily temporal.
And I want to build on team, but before, I want to re-anchor on an aspect of your on-demand kind of journey. I mean, as you said, Genentech is a data-driven company, exceedingly so. How had you expected to measure success when you started down the path with 100 sort of volunteers 3 years ago? And then what did sort of reality show to you or prove to you in management and the employees in terms of what success really was a function of? You touched on a couple of these things, but I'd love to sort of hear the quant and the qualitative aspects. And I'm asking from the vantage point of there possibly being some people on the call who are leaders at companies that have antibodies, and the tale of your journey and how you overcame those and how the argument was hypothesized and then made or proven. I think could be instructional.
This is the holy grail, and Jay and others on the phone will understand. The hardest thing is to measure the holy grail, productivity. So I don't even try to measure productivity. It's just not my business to measure productivity. It's the business of the business to measure their productivity. And I can use different examples. I can use a call center that was always face-to-face. All of the call people were in a call center that we had a physical location. And I'm sitting here going, what? Measuring a call, measuring the number of calls, measuring the quality of a call, all of that is their productivity. They can measure that. But nope, they all had to be there. They all had to prairie dog and ask each other questions. And it's like, oh my goodness gracious me. Well, guess what? We now have a virtual call center, and it took 5 years. And the way that worked was the patience, and some of you on the phone are probably going to laugh, but it required co-creation. This is another buzzword that, agility purports, but I'm not being cynical about it. Engaging the end user in a meaningful prototype. And again, I use the word prototype, which these spaces, these flexible offices, you're made for prototyping because you're not investing. You're just renting or using and trying, keep it small, try small. We did all kinds of experiments with the call centers. We did all kinds of experiments with the clinicians in terms of their ability and getting them involved. So the engagement by the end user, preferably the peeps, with the endorsement of their managers. But getting the managers involved initially is just too much overhead. It really is a middle up down kind of thing. The middle, you'll find your thought leaders. You'll find people who see that there is a perceived productivity benefit. And then clearly we're able to measure the cost savings. That's not hard. So it's usually this yin yang of cost and productivity. And the CFO will go nuts over the cost, but the employee doesn't care about the cost. So you don't want to lead with that. You definitely want to lead with the employee value prop, what's in it for the team, what's in it for the business. And we've actually have a nice little framework for measuring our ability to impact the behaviors that are linked to those productivity outcomes. And no big surprise, if there's enough people talking about it, and you can do surveys. The qualitative is very hard to measure unobtrusively. Utilization you can measure unobtrusively, and that's what we do in our drop-in centers. We know how many people are there. That's easy. So we can figure out the cost per person, and that's the whole cost thing. But then when you really get to the heart of the matter, is there an impact on the ability of the business to get its stuff done faster, better, or cheaper? And those three metrics generally turn into whatever the business unit is doing. If it's sales, it's revenue. If it's manufacturing, it's getting stuff out the door. If it's clinical trials, it's doing more trials with fewer people. So it's not that hard to connect what we do to what they're trying to do, but you got to take them along. You got to make all these prototypes theirs. It's got to be theirs. It can't be ours.
And then you have the X factor outcomes, such as that employee story that Gig and Maria shared it with me when I was last on site at you. One of those customer stories, it was the Genentech employee that had a sick partner. And the narrative was, I think it was something to the effect of, thank you. If not for this, I would not have been able to stay at Genentech. And I remember Gig and Maria sort of translating it into, well, that goes right at the heart of the cost of an employee, the cost of training an employee, the expense of losing an employee. And so while it's hard to predict those outcomes when they happen, maybe we shouldn't be surprised if they do when they happen.
No. And our partnership, we have a people analytics organization and I have a work environment analytics organization. And that's where we do either our unobtrusive utilization metrics or our surveys. And we do them collectively because most of the work that the people analytics do is to try to figure out hiring and retaining and who is leaving and where are they leaving. And of course there's profiling around target markets. Where are we trying to hire people? And increasingly they're not in the Bay Area. So hello, what are we going to do when we want to hire talent that may be in San Diego and they don't want to relocate to the Bay Area? Or we want to hire talent in life science. It's very big on the East Coast. And how do we create a presence there? And even if it's a presence in quotes, it doesn't have to be a big facility. It just has to scream Genentech in some way so that the employees feel that connection to the mothership, whatever the culture of that mothership is. And that will vary from company to company.
Let me tee up one last sort of topic before we take some questions from folks. And I was chatting with another one of our mutual friends, Jervis from Gensler, just yesterday, actually. And he always gives me a lot to reflect on, so I quote him heavily. But he was sort of commenting on this extraordinary opportunity for whatever the next workplace is to be something that's far more intentional. And what I think he was getting at with that was the notion of, look, people are at home right now. HQ is empty. If people do choose to leave home and are given the option of deciding whether they do or not, when they do, it'll be because of a very intentional need. Either home is noisy and distracting right now, I need a quiet place to concentrate, or I really need to be working together with Anne and Jervis, and so we're going to go find a team space. But it's intentional, it's directed. Mm-hmm. Against the backdrop of that sort of idea, whether you agree with it or not, and I'd love you to sort of debate it, but if we follow that thread, who should, we're talking reentry now, let's think about the weeks and months ahead, who should come back? Everyone's at home, who should come back, and for what purposes, and what form and function should the workplace that we allow them to have access to take? Again, if we use that sort of intentional notion as the starting point, go ahead and tear that down if you like. But
oh man, well, everyone's got an opinion, and unfortunately, we don't have the research. I can't wait to see the research that gets done on this period. I hope Jay's already working on it, because we just don't know, right. And we don't know what people are going to do. But at least my opinion is, we ought to let them decide. Right. Again, I'm a big promoter in that the people who are doing good work know where and how they need to do their work. And again, if you're a lab-based person working with a Petri dish, you got to be with that Petri dish. You're not going to try to do that from home. You're not going to take your lab home. Now, automation and AI and big data, all that stuff's happening as a backdrop. I mean, the big winner of all of this is going to be high tech yet again, right? Because they're always coming up with the next best thing to make lives, in theory, easier. So in my opinion, there will be place-based people in a company like Genentech, probably not in companies like Google. And I think Google's going to be fascinating, because the place-based stuff there is about people who are young, who just come out of school, who are hackers and love being with other guys and gals who've been in their dorms together. They eat, they socialize. And that's a mental model that I don't have. I mean, I'm not in that generation either. So I've watched them all. I kind of like the 5 generations working together. I think there's a lovely benefit of reverse mentoring and wisdom and passing stuff down. So I kind of like the idea of having 5 generations in some mixed model. I would never want anyone to have to go back in unless they want to, because that's their work and that's how their work is supported and that's how they have to do it. And I would submit that that is a percentage of every company, even if it's a high-tech company, but it's going to vary. But I really, really believe that a lot of our individuals who've learned that they can be productive and their teams are actually working together okay online will probably want to come back to a hybrid. They're not going to want to commute because look at the air, it's clean. You know, the idea of, and especially some employees that are very keen on sustainability, they're liking that they're not polluting by driving cars. Social distancing, we may not want to sit on a bus like right next to somebody like we used to. I mean, there's so many hypotheses out there right now that we at Genentech are actually working on to make some assumptions about whether we even open all of our buildings or not.
And it's interesting, you know, you touch on air. Like, I think that's a nice example. There are so many, I think as COVID has pulled the curtain back on the traditional way that we had been doing office, there are some truths, or at least some strong hypotheses that are starting to show up at the environmental and sustainable level. We can now see what the implications of changing the patterns are.
Sure.
Air in every major city around the planet is remarkably clearer. Can we hold on to all of that? Can we retain all of that gain? Perhaps not, but we can see it. Like the hypothesis is being experimented. From a financial standpoint, we're seeing that even with headquarters not being utilized, work is getting done.
Work is getting done, and and again, right now it's testimonial basis. Anyone doing research on the work getting done, but did they not believe? They believed it wasn't getting done before, and they believe it's getting done now. And everybody in this field knows belief is so critical. And if you can augment it with data and metrics, yay. But if the belief is not there, and in most cases where you get the resistance, it's all belief-based, and you have to honor it. You know, you argue with it, which I've had years of doing, and God knows I've got scar tissue for it. I've learned the wisdom is don't argue beliefs. So I think what'll be fascinating is to actually see, you know, and I think we've talked about this, Mark, what I'd like to call it back to better. You know, rather than return to campus or back to work, which makes me nuts. The implication is we're not working now. When I hear somebody say that, it's like, what? But I got to chill, because some people are saying that. When we get back to work, it's like, no. It's back to better. Right. And what we've learned, we need to bring into the new model, because we've learned that we can get honored and recognized for our contributions, not because of face-to-face. And that because many of us can and do work together really well this way. Not everybody. And distance work globally is going to be what it's always been. Now, will more people not fly? I mean, again, I got the Basel thing, right? I got people of our holy cow, I don't even want to tell you what our travel budget is. Of our travel budget, 60% is internal, which suggests it's people flying to each other's sites. Now, with a time zone difference, you got that added difficulty in terms of you can't do spontaneous meetings; they have to be scheduled. But I'm going to contend we're not going to, that 60% travel is not going to come back. It mustn't. It can't, because the company, and all of our companies are getting hurt a little bit economically. They're going to want to save money in the short term. Travel's going to be a real easy, low-hanging fruit one for a while.
Yeah, well, grabbing
Mark,
that.
Ann, sorry, I just want to make sure that we're allowing some time for questions. We have quite a few, actually. So we've got about a little over 10 minutes. Just want to make sure we're addressing questions not only in the Q&A, but we do have some in chat as well.
Super. Yeah, look, let's grab that statement you just made and that phrase of back to better. I mean, I think a postcard from the near future that we would, or a headline from the near future that we would all like to be able to make our own. You know, and I think there's the opportunity for it to be better for the empowered employees that are being given choice, and it can also be better for, you know, bless them, the bean counters and the corporate heads that want to see better in terms of ESG, corporate sustainability, bottom line costs. So yeah, let's take some of the questions. So Casey, let's make sure I don't miss some, but I'm looking in the chat line. Is there a QA line as well?
Yeah, we have a couple in QA right now, and then we have quite a few in chat. I know that Jeremy raised his hand early on, so I want to make sure if he has a question that he addresses it. We can put that in the Q&A. But Rafi has some questions in chat. Quite a few. Might want to answer a couple of these, and then we can maybe schedule a one-on-one or address these in a follow-up.
Super. And I hope folks don't mind, but I may identify some of the questioners. But a question from Rafi. Do you use any management technology tool to track space use at your campus and the regional, national, and global level? I can comment on the tracking of your on-demand network, but if you want to start, perhaps commenting on what.
No, and it's a good question, Rafi. And I think we're known for prototyping, and so my my work environment analytics group is actually in partnership with a couple of outside vendors. We're sort of building our own. It's sensor based, and it's not a lighting system, and it's not something you put on furniture. It's actually a triangulation of Wi-Fi and cameras in the ceiling. And it took a while, again, the resistance of privacy and all that. But I mean, the value prop was there to try to understand. I mean, we don't want to track individuals because the sensor actually, it gets all masked before the data gets collected. And the data is being collected. So we now know where people are. We can, if we had to, figure out the individuals, but that's not the point. So yes, we are actively measuring utilization in an unobtrusive way.
And then I would add across Genentech's on-demand network, I mean, which they're using the LiquidSpace platform to facilitate.
Yes.
And her team have real-time reporting and visibility, line of sight to where those 15,000 employees are booking. So she gave them choice. The platform put that choice in the hands and on the phones of the employees, but then she can observe and see what the pathways are that are being worn in on a daily basis, if you will.
So no, I think it's really important to be able to measure utilization so you know where the hot spots are.
And a question from our friend Harold Becker at Microsoft.
Hi, Harold, how are you?
He says, in many ways, the new unit of productivity is project work by teams. Yes. How do you enable teams to do meaningful project work in drop-in spaces?
Well, Harold, let's partner up on that, because this was the thing that was on my plate before COVID. And we are actively trying to figure out the business case that would then allow teams. Right now, I'm targeting the field because they're geographically based. It would be really hard to try to get people from the East Bay and the South Bay to want a team in Novato. But the field is extremely geographic based. And we're playing with the idea of having on-demand locations for them, their patients, their customer. I mean, it's a whole new ecosystem that's evolving. And you're absolutely right. The unit of measurement is going to be the team. And where places is relevant, I will be focusing on these affordances to experiment. Should something prove to be valuable in the long term, we might reconsider. But I honestly think this on-demand stuff is going to have incredible value in the short term for people to experiment and kick the tires.
And I think, you know, and from some of the planning discussions that you've allowed us to be a part of around what would team spaces as part of your network of place need to be. Right. Harold, the other comment I think it's important to call out is those would likely not be drop-in in a purely transactional sense. It might be a team space that has been taken for a month or 6 months or a year, and also likely has some elements of tailoring that support sort of the explicit work activities of that team, whether they're going to be, you know, wet labbing or collaborating or whatever it might be.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important call out. Thank you, Mark, because individuals are working from home. Teams may need place-based, preserved state, and they're going to want to customize it. So absolutely, it's going to be different than going to Starbucks.
Right, and I don't want you to think about this one too much, but I'm going to ask it in lightning round fashion. I want you to give me the impulsive answer because I'm not sure it'll be any more or less true than the thoughtful one. So, when the dust settles, do you think companies will occupy more office space to accommodate distancing, or less space because more people are working from home? More or less space? What's the outlook for HQ?
Oh my goodness, much less.
Yeah, there you go, Gabe. Much less.
Much less.
One opinion off the cuff.
Yeah, and it'll change. I mean, I think the idea of individual offices is already old. Because as Harold pointed out, much work is team-based now, and people do like moving around, and no one person is in one place all day. So the office, the individual office, I think, is a vestige of the past.
I'll share a comment from our friend Eric Johnson at Deloitte. and Ann, if you want to add to it, you're welcome to.
Eric knows more about this than I do, so I'm sure it's a hard question.
More of a comment, but I'll let you react to it. I think the general premise of going back to the office will have to change from I have to go to the office to I need to go to the office,
right?
Which focuses even more on trusting employees to do the right thing to get their job.
Right. Well, and I also think there's a difference between need and want. Again, I think need is the ability. Does your job allow you? That's a need. And if you're going to a manufacturing plant, that's a need. Yeah. But there's also the want. You know, some people want to, and I don't. I mean, and I think, and this, I'll just throw this out to the audience. This whole water cooler thing that everybody's been talking about for years is, how do I do water cooler when I'm virtual? In my opinion, and this is my opinion, and I don't want to be quoted, but in my opinion, when you go to the water cooler, you see the same damn people all the time anyway. So, I mean, I don't want to keep talking to the same guy. You know, I love the idea of a water cooler being a totally different thing in the future, where we're actually aware of a global audience where you can get answers. And yes, it's not going to be as spontaneous, and we're going to have to figure out how to be spontaneous virtually.
It's reunion day. Another question from another friend, Ann, Gary Miss Eunice. How does workplace, quotes, how does workplace organization report into the C-suite? Question. Can you comment on any trends you see of such orgs reporting into talent officers? So, and let me just sort of or ad lib on top of Gary's question. Like,
sure.
If we're giving flexibility and choice to employees, right? If we're empowering them, if we're putting trust behind them, if we're looking to learn the ground truth from the choices that they make out in this flexible sphere, I mean, that's very much an employee-centric thing. Does that foretell a macro shift, as Gary's maybe asking, toward, you know, place becoming a part of people in the organizational structure? What do you
You know, I've always, and again, this is another Annism, and if anyone knows Eric Rickard, he was a very, very strong partner of mine at Sun, and then we actually did some consulting for a while. We've always believed that it's an integrated system, and it would be silly to think of place in a silo from HR, in a silo from IT. That convergence has, I think, finally happened. Now, are budgets managed that way? No. Should they be? Yeah, because HR never has money. IT never has money. Real estate has money because of bricks and mortar, and because we can then fudge around with our bricks and mortar so we can create some funding for the investment in new kinds of things. But it's got to be I don't see it. I think the CEO or the CFO really needs to care about this. And yes, you need the money from the CFO. So trying to have it go to HR doesn't make sense to me.
One last question. I'm going to throw it to a question from Jeremy Jennings, one of the founders of Jabberbox. And before I read his question, I'll lay out a comment about what we've seen of your journey and toward on demand. You know, as you touched on, you're very quant. Your firm is very data driven. You started in a very curated fashion, like you went out and chose the spaces and the venues that would become a part of your drop-in network, and you observed, you saw the patterns, and now you've moved toward providing even more choice to employees. Jeremy asked the question, how do you think about public spaces for drop-in mobility / productivity? Is it a different filter if it's not a branded mothership environment or an explicitly called out and semi-branded Genentech environment? Like, I'll say it this way. Do you see giving Genentech employees unfettered access to the full range of what's out there in the flexible office realm?
Yes. And I think an individual is going to make a different, I mean, I can work from anywhere. That's an individual choice. As a team, I think the sense of branding, the sense of being with other co-employees has an emotional value. I do. Right. And again, it's a belief. We've not tested the non-branded in a physical environment yet. I think we like the sense of our culture and our identity. And it doesn't take much. It's color. It's furniture that we're familiar with. Yeah. You know, it's sit-stand desks that we all have gotten used to. It's certain things that scream Genentech that I think are easy enough to replicate that one couldn't put in a public space. But if somebody wants to work in a park, great. It's healthy. And we encourage that from a health perspective. You know, get outside. I should do more of that.
Well, Anne, thank you very much. And thank you all who have stayed through the full hour. For those that put questions into either the chat or the QA line that we didn't get to, I'll make a pledge that I will chase Anne down, and we'll get replies out to all of you. And to the group that's here, presumably if you attended this webinar, you are likely thinking about reentry. I hope you're contemplating one of those first principles that Anne spoke of again and again, which is trust the employees and consider augmenting work from home as part of what reentry means. And if that notion resonates with you, you know, whether you're just getting started in formulating a strategy around how you might augment home, or whether you've ventured further already and are starting to assess what your employee needs might be and where you'll need those locations, or if you are even further down the path and you are looking to deliver solutions today, tomorrow, next week, we can help. And we would be privileged to assist you. And then before I let you all go, this was part one of a 3-part series. The next part 2 section is going to be a week from today on May 28th. And we'll be tackling the topic of hub and spoke offices from the vantage point of corporate looking out. How can a hub and spoke architecture of my workplace landscape aid in both de-densifying my corporate headquarters, which might be a part-time need or a temporary need, and then also how can hub and spoke as a topology also be a powerful lever to rationalize or right-size my workplace from a square footage, environmental, and cost standpoint for the long term. So if you find that interesting, join us again next week. And again, Anne, thank you so very much.
This is great. I really am grateful to all of you. This has been, it's a community.
Yeah, it is. Everyone, please stay safe. We care about y'all, and we'll see you out there. Cheers.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, Anne. We got some folks that are still hanging up, but I'm gonna draw it to a close.
Sign off.
Cheers.
Bye.